The snow did not fall softly that night. It came sideways, violent and white and indifferent, driven by a wind that tore through the private estate district of northern Seoul like something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. The iron gates of the Jeon family compound stood 12 feet tall, wrought black steel crowned with gilded crests that had meant something once. Dignity. Legacy. A name that opened doors before a hand could reach for the handle. The gates opened from the inside, and then they slammed shut. The sound rang out across the frozen courtyard, a sound like finality, like a sentence being handed down without appeal. Christabel hit the snow on her knees first. If you love stories like this, please hit the subscribe button so you get to see more captivating videos daily from 19 stories. She didn't scream. She had been trained not to by this same family, inside those same walls, in rooms that gleamed with imported marble and smelled of orchid arrangements changed every Tuesday. She pressed one palm to the ground and tried to rise, but her legs were not cooperating, and the cold had already begun its work. The silk blouse she wore, white, expensive, completely wrong for February in Seoul, absorbed the wet snow instantly and pressed against her skin like a punishment. Her father's voice came from behind the gate, not through it, through the intercom speaker mounted into the stone pillar, because he had not come outside. He would not dirty his shoes. He would not let his face be seen by the security cameras of the neighboring estates if this ever became a legal matter. "You had one instruction," he said. His Korean was clipped and precise, the sole dialect of men who had been to the right schools and married the right women and donated to the right causes. "One, and you refused." Christabel lifted her face. The snow caught in her lashes. She could feel the cold working up from her knees into her thighs, methodical and patient, and some faraway part of her mind registered that she needed to get up. She needed to move. But the larger part of her was still standing in the boardroom 2 hours ago, watching her father slide the documents across the polished table, watching his face, that composed, immovable face, and knowing exactly what he was asking her to sign. "Those accounts were illegal," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. She kept her eyes on the speaker grill even though it wasn't his eyes. It would never be his eyes. "The transfers were illegal. If I had signed those statements, I would have been." "You would have been family," he said. "You would have been protected." A pause. The wind screamed past her and she bent her head against it. The emerald on her right hand caught the gate light for 1 second, a single green flash in all that white and black, before her fist closed around it. "I am your daughter," she said. The speaker crackled. "You were," said Senator Jeon Byung-cheol. "As of tonight, that is no longer accurate. Your accounts have been closed. Your name will be removed from the family registry by morning. If you attempt to contact your brother, his phone will not receive your calls." The speaker went silent. The gate did not open again. Christabel stayed on her knees for a long moment, not because she was defeated, though later she would not be entirely sure about that, but because her body was beginning to shut down in the careful, sequential way that extreme cold dismantles a person, and she had a choice to make. She could pound on the gate. She could scream. She could perform the grief that was pressing up behind her sternum like something molten and trapped, or she could get up. She could move. She could survive the night first and fall apart later, in warmth, in private, in the way she had always processed everything, alone and completely. She chose the second option. She got up. She walked. The estate district was 6 kilometers of gated compounds, private roads, and manicured tree lines that in summer created green tunnels and in winter became something else entirely, skeletal and dark, the bare branches thick with ice. There were no taxis here, no rideshare pickups. The residents did not require taxis. They had drivers who waited in warm underground garages and received calls, not texts. Christabel walked with her arms crossed over her chest, her heeled boots punching through the top layer of frozen snow with each step. And she counted her breaths the way she had learned to count them in Lagos when she was 17, and her mother had just died, and the world had seemed similarly uninterested in her survival. 1, 2, 3. She made it perhaps 400 meters before her legs stopped responding correctly. The cold was no longer on the outside of her. It was inside her now, moving through her bloodstream with the same calm inevitability as a tide, and her vision had begun to soften at the edges in a way that she recognized from somewhere: a medical textbook, a survival documentary, the particular gray haze of a body conserving its last heat. She made it to the side of the road. She made it to the low stone wall of a neighboring property. She put her back against it and slid down slowly, and the snow received her without comment. She was not afraid. That was the strange part. She was cold and she was tired, and she was somewhere beneath all of it furious, with a fury so deep and controlled it had no heat left in it. But she was not afraid. She closed her eyes. 3 kilometers away, inside a building that appeared on no public registry and had no name on its exterior, a man sat at a long obsidian desk and reviewed footage. His name was Seo Kangmin. If you ask the financial press, they would tell you he was the founder and chairman of Seo Capital Group, a private investment conglomerate with holdings across Asia, the Middle East, and 3 Caribbean jurisdictions. They would tell you he was 37. They would tell you he had studied at KAIST and briefly at the London School of Economics before returning to Seoul to build something they couldn't fully categorize. The profiles tended to use words like reclusive and unconventional and quietly influential, which were the polite vocabulary of journalists who knew something was not being said, but couldn't prove what. If you asked the people who actually knew what moved in the dark corridors of Seoul's criminal architecture, the enforcement networks, the money channels, the agreements that kept certain powerful families safe and certain other powerful families in line, they would tell you something different. They would tell you that Seo Kangmin had taken over the Seo network at 29 after his father died under circumstances that were called natural and discussed as otherwise. They would tell you he had spent the following 8 years systematically absorbing, dismantling, or neutralizing every rival operation in the city's northern corridor. They would tell you he had done all of it without a single criminal conviction, without a single confirmed public incident, without ever being photographed looking like anything other than a man attending a boring business meeting. They would tell you he was the most dangerous person in Seoul. He was reviewing the perimeter footage from the Estate District Camera Network, a network that officially belonged to a private security firm and unofficially fed directly to his desk, when he saw her. The timestamp read 23:47. She was walking along the road with her arms crossed, her dark hair pressed flat by the snow, her pace deliberate in the way that people walk when walking is all that remains. He watched her for 40 seconds without moving. Then he watched her reach the wall. Then he watched her sit down against it and close her eyes. He pressed the intercom. Yoon. The response was immediate. Sir. Gate 3. There is a woman in the snow. Bring her inside. A pause that lasted exactly 1 second, long enough to register surprise, not long enough to question. Understood. Seo Kangmin looked at the frozen image on the screen for a moment longer. Then he turned back to the documents on his desk, because there were always documents, and because the answer to why he had given that order was not something he was willing to examine yet. He told himself it was practical. He told himself it was the same instinct that made him pick up useful things. He told himself he did not act on sentiment. He turned the page. He kept working. She woke up to warmth, which confused her, because warmth was not what she had been expecting. The ceiling above her was high, 3, maybe 4 meters, coffered in dark wood with recessed lighting that had been dimmed to something amber and gentle. She turned her head slowly, cataloging. Silk sheets, an IV line running to her left arm, a medical monitor on a cart by the bed, its screen green and steady. Showing numbers, that meant she was alive. The window to her left was floor to ceiling, Seoul spread out beyond it in its midnight geography of lights and Han River reflections and the dark mass of Bugaksan against the sky. The room was enormous, spare, and absolutely without warmth in any decorative sense. No flowers, no personal objects, no photographs, but the actual temperature was perfect, and the bed was the most expensive thing she had ever lain in. She catalogued the exits next. Force of habit. Door to her right, closed, no visible lock from this side. A second door that likely led to a bathroom. The window, 20, 25 floors up, she estimated. She filed all of this without visible movement, her face still, her breathing controlled, because before she moved or spoke or revealed anything, she needed to understand where she was and who had her. The door opened. The man who entered was not the one she would have expected in a room like this. He was tall, close to 6 feet, with the particular posture of someone who had never needed to make himself larger in a room, because the room already adjusted to him. He wore a dark cashmere sweater and charcoal trousers, and no tie and no watch and no jewelry of any kind. And his face was the kind of face that would have been handsome in a conventional sense if it hadn't been so entirely still. Not cold, precisely. Still, like a body of water that went very deep and showed nothing on the surface. He stopped 2 meters from the bed. He looked at her with an expression that gave her nothing to work with. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low and even. Korean with a trace of something else. Years abroad, maybe, or the particular flattening effect of a man who had learned to speak in rooms where tone meant everything. "I am," she said. Her voice came out lower than intended, roughened by cold and whatever they'd given her for the hypothermia. She did not apologize for it. "The doctor says another 20 minutes in that snow, and your organs would have begun shutting down." "I'm aware of what hypothermia does." Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, more like recalibration, the micro-adjustment of a man who had prepared for one kind of conversation and was being offered another. "Do you know where you are?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I know what you are." A pause. "What am I?" She held his gaze. The IV line pulled slightly against her arm when she shifted upright, and she moved it without looking at it, the way you move a thing that is inconvenient but not important. "The kind of man who has 20-floor buildings with perimeter cameras and private medical staff on call at midnight and no name on the front of his building," she said. "In this district, in this city." She let that sit. "I have enough context." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the chair from beside the wall, unhurried, no performance, and sat down. He leaned back, one ankle crossed over his knee, and he looked at her the way he might look at a document he hadn't decided how to classify yet. "Your name," he said, not a question. "Christabel," she said. "Christabel Adiz Okonkwo." "Nigerian." "My father is Korean." A beat. "Was, apparently as of last night I no longer have a father." "Senator Jeon, he said. The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Christabel did not flinch. She watched his face instead, watched the complete absence of surprise on it, the way he said the name, the way you say the name of something you have already known for a long time. "You know him," she said. "I know of him," he said. The distinction was careful, deliberate. "He funds your rivals," she said. Now the stillness in his face shifted. It wasn't alarm, it was something colder and more focused, a sharpening. He studied her for a long moment without speaking. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because I saw the accounts," she said. "That's why he threw me out. He needed me to sign statements confirming the transfers were legitimate investment funds going to a registered holding company. I refused because they were. The receiving entity was dissolved 14 months ago. The money was being routed through a ghost structure." "And the volume," she paused, and something moved behind her eyes, something she controlled but didn't entirely eliminate. The volume was significant enough that someone on the other end was funding an operation, not a company. Seo Kangman did not move for a long moment. Outside, Seoul glittered in its enormous indifference, 40 floors below, the Han River a dark ribbon stitched with light. Snow continued to fall against the window in slow diagonals. "You analyzed routing structures from transfer documents," he said. "I have a degree in financial forensics from UCL and 4 years at a compliance firm in Lagos before I came to Seoul," she said. "Yes." He uncrossed his ankle. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, the stillness in his face broke open into something that was not warmth exactly, but was its structural equivalent, focused, present, entirely undivided attention. "Why didn't you sign?" he said. "You would have been protected, comfortable, you would have had your family." Christabel looked at him for a long time. The emerald on her right hand caught the light. She hadn't lost it, somehow, through all of it. It had stayed on her finger through the cold and the fall and the whole impossible night, as though it too had decided to stay. "Because I wouldn't lie for them," she said. He held her gaze. Something passed through his eyes that she could not name, and he did not offer. "Rest," he said. He stood. He moved to the door with the same unhurried economy he'd entered with, and he paused at the threshold without turning around. "You'll be moved to better quarters in the morning," he said. "You're not a prisoner, but you're also not leaving tonight." "I wasn't planning to," she said. He left. Christabel sat in the silence of the enormous room and listened to the city and thought about the expression on his face when she'd said the name of her father's ghost company. The recognition. The calculation that had moved across his features like a shadow. He had known, she thought, some of it. Maybe not all of it, but enough that finding her was not a coincidence, or if it was, he had already decided what to do with the coincidence in the 7 seconds between seeing her on the screen and ordering Yoon to bring her in. She was not a rescue. She was a variable he had decided to collect. She understood that, and she did not panic about it because the alternative, the snow, the iron gate, her father's voice through the speaker, the gray haze closing in at the edges of her vision, the alternative was not better. She lay back against the silk pillow. She stared at the ceiling. She was alive. She was warm. She was in the home of the most dangerous man in Seoul, and her family had just erased her from every document that bore their name, and none of this was survivable through sentiment. She closed her hand around the emerald ring. She began to think. By the time they moved her to What Yoon, a compact, watchful man of about 45 with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned long ago that opinions were a liability, called the guest suite, she had already mapped 3 things. The camera positions in the hallway, the shift pattern of the men she'd seen outside her door, and the fact that the building had at minimum 2 basement levels based on the elevator panel she'd glimpsed through the door. The guest suite was larger than her apartment in Mapogu had been. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. A walk-in wardrobe with clothes in her approximate size, women's clothes, expensive in dark neutral colors, which told her either someone had been sent to shop this morning or Seo Kangman maintained a supply of such things, which told its own story. She chose a black turtleneck, tailored trousers, flat leather boots. She found a brush. She found skincare in the bathroom that was unopened and in her shade and did not examine what it meant that someone had matched her shade. She dressed. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself with the same clinical attention she brought to balance sheets, assessing damage, assessing function, assessing what was still there. She was still there. The emerald ring she slipped back onto her right hand, the 4th finger. She had worn it since her mother died, her mother's ring, the one piece of Adiz Okonkwo that had survived the systematic erasure of her influence on the Jeon household. Her mother, who had been a corporate lawyer from Enugu, who had spoken 4 languages and cooked jollof rice on Sunday mornings and told Christabel when she was 12, the most dangerous thing you can be. In a room full of powerful men is calm, not hard, not cold, calm, there's a difference. Hard things shatter, calm things bend and return. She looked at the ring. She was calm. She went to find Seo Kangman. She found him, or rather was brought to him by Yoon, in a room on the 32nd floor that functioned as what she supposed was his working space. It was nothing like what she would have imagined for a man of his reputation. No weapons on display. No ostentatious furniture. It was spare and functional and almost aggressively unsentimental long desk, multiple screens, stacks of physical documents separated by colored tabs, a single espresso cup, a standing lamp behind the chair. One wall was entirely glass. One wall held a floor-to-ceiling map of the Seoul metropolitan area with overlaid data she couldn't read from the doorway. He was standing at the map when she entered. He turned. "You look better," he said. "I feel better," she said, which was true and which was also not the point. She walked to the desk without being invited and sat down on the single chair positioned across from his. She crossed one leg over the other, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him directly. "I want to understand the terms," she said. He came away from the map and settled into his chair with the economical movement that she was beginning to understand was simply how he existed in space. No excess, nothing wasted. He looked at her. "Terms," he said. "You brought me inside because I'm useful," she said. "Not out of kindness, I'm not offended by that, but I need to understand what you expect from the utility." She paused. "And what you're offering in exchange." A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. More like the silence before a negotiation properly begins, both parties taking the measure of the table. "Your father's network has been quietly funding a coalition I have been working to dismantle for 3 years," he said. "Political money rooted through ghost structures, as you identified. They finance enforcement, logistics, legal interference, enough to make certain operations very difficult without creating anything I can directly confront. Because it's laundered through legitimate political capital," she said. "Because it's laundered through legitimate political capital," he confirmed. "I know the shape of the network. I don't have the internal documentation, the transfer logs, the entity chains." "Which I've seen," she said. "Which you've seen." She was quiet for a moment. "You want me to reconstruct what I saw?" "I want you to help me understand the financial architecture," he said. "The full picture, where the money enters, where it pools, how it moves. If I have that, I can make choices about how to proceed." "And if I help you," she said, "what happens to me?" He looked at her steadily. "You're no longer in the snow," he said. "You have resources, protection, time to determine what you want to do next." "That's not a contract," she said. "That's a sentiment." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile, but it was the architecture of one, the structural antecedent. "What would a contract look like?" he said. "Specificity," she said. "What protection means, what access I have, what happens when this is over." She paused. "And what happens if I decide I'm done before you're done?" He studied her for a long moment. Outside the glass wall, Seoul was gray-white and endless, the blizzard still working, the Han River hidden under weather. "You can leave at any time," he said. "My people will not stop you. But the world outside this building currently contains your father's network, which already considers you a liability and has resources I do not need to explain to you. Inside this building, you are safe. That is a material difference." "And the access?" "To information relevant to the financial reconstruction, full." He paused. "To other operations, selective, based on need." "I'll want to work," she said. "Not just consult. I'll want a desk, a system, access to the documents you already have." "That can be arranged." She uncrossed her legs. She sat forward slightly. "One more thing," she said. He waited. "I'm not doing this to hurt my father," she said. The words came out even and unambiguous. "I'm doing it because those transfers were illegal and the people they harmed were real, and I refused to lie about it once and I'm not going to start now. The fact that it helps you is incidental. I need you to understand that distinction because it affects how I work." He looked at her for a long time. The expression on his face was the one she was beginning to be able to read, not the outer stillness but something beneath it, the slight shift in register that meant he was genuinely engaged, genuinely recalibrating. "Understood," he said. "Then we have a working arrangement," she said. She stood. She held out her right hand. The emerald caught the gray morning light from the window. He stood. He looked at her hand, then at her face, and he crossed the desk and shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and told her nothing she didn't already expect, controlled, precise, nothing given away. "Welcome to the building, Christabel Adiz Okonkwo," he said. She withdrew her hand. She turned for the door. "One question," he said behind her. She stopped. She didn't turn around. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine observation, offered with the slight quality of someone noting an anomaly in data they'd expected to be straightforward. She considered this. She thought of the snow. She thought of her father's voice through a speaker. She thought of her mother's ring and the shape of calm versus hard. I've already survived the most dangerous person in my world tonight, she said. You're going to need to work up to that ranking. She walked out. Behind her, in the spare and functional room with the map on the wall and the espresso cup, and the gray Seoul morning pressing against the glass, Seo Kangmin stood at his desk for a moment longer than he needed to. And then, very quietly, in a room where he was entirely alone, he allowed the thing at the corner of his mouth to complete itself. If you're already invested in Christabel's story, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. She worked the way she had always worked, methodically, without theater, with the kind of focus that made the people around her slightly uneasy because it so thoroughly excluded them. Yoon set her up in a secondary office on the 31st floor, 2 screens, a secured local network terminal, a printer, and a locked filing drawer to which he gave her the key without being asked. She appreciated that, the gesture of not making her ask. She appreciated efficiency wherever she found it. She cataloged the documents Seo Kangmin's people had already assembled on the rival network's financing. 3 years of careful collection, organized with the precision of someone who understood financial architecture even if they hadn't been trained in it, and she began building the map. The transfer logs she reconstructed from memory first. This was not as extraordinary as it sounded. She had spent 4 years at a Lagos compliance firm where the methodology for unraveling layered financial structures was taught through repetition until it became instinct, the way musicians internalize scales. She wrote the entities in sequence, the Jeon family foundation as the originating point. A series of legitimate investment vehicles in the first layer, properly registered, properly reported, generating real returns as cover. A second layer of holding companies in jurisdictions that prioritized confidentiality. And then the termination points, the ghost structures, the dissolved entities, the routing mechanisms that existed only long enough to receive a transfer and forward it. She had seen the full chain for approximately 4 minutes before her father had taken the documents back. 4 minutes was enough. On the 3rd day, she found something in the materials Seo Kangmin's people had collected that they hadn't flagged. A recurring logistics company referenced in intercepted communications. A company that was supposed to be a freight operation, but whose registered address was a residential building in Mapogu. She pulled the thread and found that the company had received 9 payments over 18 months from one of the Jeon family's second-layer vehicles. She printed the correlation matrix. She walked it upstairs herself. Seo Kangmin was in a meeting when she arrived. She could see through the glass partition. 5 men she didn't recognize seated around the conference table, one of them speaking with the animated certainty of someone making an argument he expected to win. She did not knock. She stood outside the glass and waited, the documents held at her side. He saw her within 30 seconds. His eyes moved to her face, then to the documents, and he said something brief to the room and came to the door. "What is it?" he said, stepping into the corridor, letting the door fall mostly shut behind him. She handed him the matrix. He looked at it. She watched his face. "The logistics company," she said. "It's a relay point. Not just for money, I think it's physical. Goods or people I can't tell from the financial trail alone. But the payment volumes and timing correlate with 3 of the incidents your people flagged as," she turned to the 2nd page, "here, the ambush in September, the enforcement failure in November, the route compromise in January." He was still looking at the document. His jaw had tightened very slightly, the only external sign of whatever was happening behind the stillness. "They had our routes," he said. The words were quiet and flat. "Someone gave them your routes," she said. "And the logistics company is how the information was physically brokered. It's a cutout, a human cutout, not just a financial one. Someone inside your operation was communicating through that company." He looked up from the documents. He looked at her. "You got this from financial records," he said. "Movement of money follows movement of everything else," she said. "It's the same pattern." He was quiet for a moment. Behind the glass, the meeting had paused. She could feel it without looking, the room recalibrating around the absence of its most important person. "I need an hour to work through the full correlation," she said. "But you should know now. If there's anything sensitive scheduled in the next 72 hours, I would reconsider the route. He looked at her for a long moment. There's a transfer happening tomorrow night, he said. Northern corridor, 40-minute window. Change the corridor, she said, and tell no one until an hour before. He nodded once. He went back into the meeting. She went back downstairs. The mole, it turned out, was a man named Do-yeon. She didn't know that yet. No one knew that yet. What Christabel knew, 3 days later, was that she had been right about the route. The original northern corridor had been empty when Seo Kangman's people had sent a decoy vehicle through it at the scheduled time, and the 3 vehicles that had appeared to intercept it had been a confirmation of everything she'd mapped. The transfer itself had gone through a different corridor safely, and now the room on the 32nd floor had the specific focused energy of people who had been shown something they hadn't wanted to believe. Seo Kangman called her in that evening. The men from the meeting were gone. Yoon stood near the wall with his customary neutrality. Kangman was behind his desk, and the map behind him had new markings on it, red points connected by thin lines that she recognized as the route pattern she'd identified. You saved an operation last night, he said. I followed the data, she said. The data saved the operation. Sit down, he said. She sat. There is someone inside the network passing information, he said. You identified the mechanism. I need you to help identify the source. She had been expecting this. She had been thinking about it for 2 days, actually, turning the correlation data, looking at the access pattern, mapping who could have known which route was scheduled, and could have communicated that knowledge through the logistics cut out in the window between announcement and execution. The window is narrow, she said. Whoever is passing information knew the route no more than 12 hours in advance but still had time to broker the information. That means they're close to your operational planning. Not external intelligence, internal source, regular access. How many people have that access? Yoon said from the wall. His voice was careful. That's your number, not mine, she said. But I can cross-reference the communication timing pattern with personnel movement logs if you give me access. A silence. Kangman looked at Yoon. Something passed between them, the shorthand of 2 people who had worked together a long time, and then Kangman looked back at her. Full access, he said, to movement logs, communication records, personnel files. Yoon made a small sound that was not quite an objection, but was the shape of one. She already found the thing we missed, Kangman said without looking at him. Give her access. She found Do-yeon in 6 days. She did not confront him. She was not built for confrontation in that register, the dramatic reveal, the accusation across a room. Instead, she built a file, clean and thorough and unambiguous, and she placed it in front of Seo Kangman on a Thursday morning with her hands folded and her face neutral, and let the document speak. He read it without speaking. The office was very quiet. Outside, the snow had finally relented and left Seoul in a clean gray stillness, the sky pressed low, the city exhausted and scrubbed. Do-yeon, he said, flat, no inflection. He's been communicating through the logistics cutout since last March, she said. 14 confirmed instances. The financial signature is consistent. Each communication correlates with a payment from the Jeon family's 3rd-layer vehicle, structured as invoice payments for freight services that never occurred. He's been with me for 7 years, Kangman said. She said nothing. There was nothing useful she could say to that, and she did not fill silences with useless things. He closed the file. He set it on the desk. He looked out at the gray Seoul morning for a long moment, and she watched his profile, the controlled stillness of it, the slight tension at the jaw, and felt, for the first time, the texture of what it cost him to exist in a world where trust was a permanent liability. Thank you, he said, quietly. She stood. She picked up her copy of the file. I'll be downstairs, she said. She was at the door when he said, Christabel. She stopped. Why haven't you asked me for anything? He said. In 2 weeks, you've given me 3 critical pieces of intelligence. You haven't asked for money, for concessions, for contact with anyone outside. You haven't asked me to move against your father. She turned around slowly. She looked at him across the room. "I told you," she said. "I'm not doing this to hurt him." "Then what are you doing it for?" The question was genuine, not strategic. She had learned the difference between his strategic questions and his genuine ones, though the difference was subtle and most people would not have noticed it. This was genuine. He actually wanted to know. She thought about it, about her mother's voice on a Sunday morning over jollof rice, about the boardroom table and her father's hands sliding documents toward her, and the specific quality of the silence that followed when she said no. About the snow. About waking up in a warm room that was not hers and choosing, in the first 5 minutes of consciousness, to be useful rather than afraid. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said, "and because I have learned that doing the right thing does not always protect you, but not doing it changes you in ways you don't recover from." She paused. "I have already lost enough of myself to this family. I will not lose that too." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Go rest," he said. "You've been working 18-hour days." "I'm fine." "I know," he said. "Go rest anyway." She went. The message came from her brother. Not through an official channel. Soo-hyun had always been more careful than their father, more lateral in his thinking, more willing to use the spaces between rules rather than break them openly. He reached her through a mutual contact she had not spoken to in 3 years, a woman named Yoon-seo who had been a colleague at the compliance firm, and who sent a message that was casual in tone and empty of information, except for 3 words embedded in its middle. "He wants to talk." Christabel read the message twice. Then she set her phone face down on the desk and stared at the wall for a moment and thought about Soo-hyun, about his face at family dinners, carefully neutral, about the way he had learned to disappear inside rooms, to be present without being visible, to survive their father by becoming invisible to him. She had always understood Soo-hyun's survival strategy even when she couldn't share it. He had never had her particular stubbornness. He was not built for the kind of refusal that cost everything. She picked the phone back up. She replied, "Tell him I'm listening." She also, separately, typed a brief message to Yoon. "I received an outside communication. I'm going to share the contents with you and with Mr. Seo. I want it on record that I disclose this immediately." Yoon replied within 2 minutes. "Understood. Thank you." She exhaled. The actual communication from her brother came 36 hours later. Through the same relay, and it was longer than she expected. Soo-hyun had always been terse. The length told her something before the content did. He was frightened. Not of their father. Soo-hyun had long ago made his peace with their father's particular brand of controlled menace. He was frightened of something else. "Father knows where you are," it said. "Not the address, but the affiliation. He has been told you are inside the Seo network. He is planning to move publicly. There is a police contact, Assistant Commissioner Lim, who is being prepared to execute a raid framed as an organized crime investigation. Father will provide evidence fabricated over the last 2 weeks that connects the Seo operation to a trafficking charge. Your name will be included as a material witness. The goal is to extract you and destroy the network simultaneously. This is scheduled for no earlier than Thursday and no later than the following Tuesday." She read it once. She read it again. She set the phone down on her knee and sat in the spare, careful silence of her office and thought about the specific construction of what her father had built, the architecture of it, the way every mechanism pointed simultaneously at more than one target. The raid was not just about her. The raid was the culmination of 3 years of preparation, the move the rival network had been building toward, the reason the financial support had been flowing this whole time. Her presence was a bonus, an emotional lever, a way to muddy the evidentiary picture around the Seo operation. She had not been rescued by accident. She had been rescued by a man who collected useful things, and she had made herself more useful than he'd anticipated. And now the same family that had thrown her into the snow was about to use her presence here as the instrument of destruction. She picked up the phone. She called Yoon. "I need to speak to him," she said. "Now." The meeting lasted 4 hours. She laid everything on the table, Soo-hyun's message, her own analysis of what it meant structurally, the fabricated evidence timeline, the specific pressure point of Assistant Commissioner Lim. She was thorough and she was fast, and she did not spare her father or herself or the full ugliness of what she was describing, because clarity was more important than anything else now, and sentiment had no seat in this room. Kangmin listened without interrupting. The men around the table, she recognized two of them from the earlier meeting, unfamiliar faces, closed expressions, listened in the same focused silence. Yoon took notes. When she finished, there was a silence. Then one of the men, late 40s, thick-necked, a scar along the left jaw that had the specific quality of a very old decision, said, "How do we know this isn't the play? She brings us information that panics us into moving. We expose our own vulnerabilities in the scramble, and the actual move comes in the confusion." He didn't look at her when he said it. He said it to the room, which was both a social performance and a genuine argument, and she did not take it personally because it was a reasonable argument. "You don't," she said. He looked at her then. "You can't verify my loyalty through certainty. You can only verify it through time and pattern. I found the mole. I corrected the route. I disclosed this contact immediately and offered you the full content before speaking to my brother again." She paused. "If I were the play, I would have been more expensive to run." A silence. Kangmin looked at the scar-jawed man. "She disclosed within 2 hours of receiving initial contact," he said, "before she knew the content." He said it without emphasis, which was its own emphasis. The man said nothing more. What happened next happened over 6 days, and it happened in the specific low-heat, high-pressure way that real financial war happens. Not in boardrooms, not in confrontations, but in documents and transfers and the patient, methodical severing of structural supports. Christabel worked 20-hour days. She didn't eat properly and she didn't sleep enough, and she was, in some deep and unexamined register, more alive than she had been in years. Because the work was real, because it mattered, because each document she reconstructed, and each entity she mapped, and each financial connection she exposed was a tile being removed from the floor her father's power stood on, and the floor was beginning to shake. She built the full exposure package herself. The original transfer logs reconstructed from memory, cross-referenced with the intercept data from Kangmin's files, cross-referenced again with 3 years of public financial records that, individually, meant nothing, and together told a story that was clear and catastrophic. She did not need to fabricate anything. The truth was sufficient. The truth was, in fact, more damaging than anything manufactured could have been, because it was real and traceable, and involved the names and accounts and decisions of real people who had left real marks. Kangmin reviewed every page. He sat across from her at the long desk on the 32nd floor for 3 evenings running, going through the documentation methodically, asking precise questions, and she answered them, and she watched him process the architecture of what her family had built, and she watched something in his face that was neither satisfaction nor disgust, but a kind of cold, clear recognition. The face of a man seeing the full shape of a thing he had suspected, but not known. On the 5th evening, he looked up from the final page and said, "This is enough." "It's more than enough," she said. He looked at her. "Are you certain you want to do this?" She thought about the iron gate. She thought about the speaker crackle. She thought about her name being removed from the family registry by morning, her brother's careful invisibility, her mother's ring on her finger through all of it. "He made his choice," she said. "I'm making mine." The arrests began on a Tuesday. Not through a police raid. Kangmin was too precise for that, and Assistant Commissioner Lim had been quietly handed to a prosecutor in the Financial Crimes Division through a chain of contacts that left no fingerprints. The evidence package was delivered anonymously to 3 separate legal entities: the prosecution office, a specific investigative journalist at one of the major dailies, and a regulatory body that had been quietly investigating the Jeon Family Foundation for 18 months without the material it needed to proceed. All 3 acted within 48 hours. Senator Jeon Byung-cheol was taken in for questioning on a Wednesday morning. The footage showed him walking out of his vehicle outside the prosecution building in a gray suit, his face perfectly composed, the composure of a man who had survived every previous challenge by outlasting it. His press representative issued a statement about full cooperation and baseless allegations. The statement was not entirely wrong. He cooperated, eventually, because the evidence left no other architecture to stand on. Christabel watched the footage on a news stream on her laptop, alone in her office, with a cup of tea going cold beside her. She felt less than she expected. Not nothing, there was something there, a low and complicated grief, the grief of a person who had wanted a father and received instead a function, a man who had treated her as a resource and then as a liability and then as a weapon and had never, in any of those configurations, seen her. That grief was real, but it was old grief. It had been there long before the snow. She turned off the stream. She picked up her tea. She held it in both hands and looked out at Seoul, which was doing what Seoul always did, moving, relentless, indifferent, beautiful in its scale. The final meeting happened a week later. She had asked for it herself. Yoon had arranged it for late afternoon, and she had dressed carefully, the black turtleneck again, the tailored trousers, the flat leather boots, the emerald ring. And she had walked upstairs with the same deliberate pace she had maintained since the first night, when she had woken in a strange room and chosen function over fear. Kangmin was at the window when she entered. He turned. He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand as his baseline, watchful, calibrated, almost completely closed, and then he said, "Sit down." She sat. He came to the desk and sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had so much to say that they were both taking the measure of where to begin. "It's over," he said. "The criminal proceeding is beginning," she said. "That's different from over." "For them," he said. "For us, the network threat is neutralized, the funding is cut. The operation that's been running interference for 3 years is gone." She nodded. "What do you want to do now?" he said. It was a different question than the one he'd asked her 2 weeks ago. Then it had been tactical. "What do you want, so I can calculate the exchange?" Now it was something else. Something that sat in the room between them with a different weight. She looked at him. She thought about what the answer actually was, not the answer she could defend in a negotiation, not the answer that was strategically optimal, but the real answer, the one she had been turning over in the quiet hours of the last week while the case assembled itself and Seoul showed its gray and golden face, and she had slept, finally, in something that approached genuine rest. "I want to build something," she said. "I've spent 4 years inside other people's financial structures. I know how they're built. I know how they fail. I want to build one of my own." She paused. "Something real, compliance-forward, the kind of structure that doesn't require ghost entities and legislative protection to survive." He looked at her for a long moment. "In Seoul," he said. "In Seoul," she said. "I know the landscape here. I know the risks. And..." She paused, and something shifted in her face, a small and controlled shift that she allowed deliberately, the way you open a window to let one thing through without opening the whole wall. "I want to stay." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" She held his gaze. "You know why," she said. The still surface of his expression held. And then, in the late afternoon light of the 32nd floor office with Seoul, spread out golden and gray and enormous behind the glass, something moved in Seo Kangmin's face that she had not seen there before, not the structural antecedent of a smile, not the recalibration of a man processing new information, but something older and quieter than either of those things, something that moved through the stillness like light through water. He did not say anything for a long moment. "There's a building in Gangnam," he said finally. "Office space, 8 floors. It's been sitting in a holding company for 2 years. The holding company is mine." He paused. "I've been deciding what to do with it." She said nothing. She waited. "If you're building something," he said, "it would be impractical to build it without the right infrastructure." She looked at him. "Is that a business proposition?" "It's a conversation," he said. "The proposition comes after the conversation." She was quiet for a moment. "What's the conversation?" He leaned back. He looked at her with the full, undivided attention that she had come to understand was the truest form of his regard. Not words, not gestures, but the quality of being seen entirely by a person who rarely looked at anything for longer than it was operationally necessary. "You walked into my office 2 weeks ago and told me you had limits," he said. "That you would help me, but you weren't doing it for me. That your loyalty was to the work, not to the outcome." He paused. "I have not met many people who operate that way." "It's just honesty," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't just honesty, it's a particular kind of character." He paused again, and she could see him choosing the words with the precision he brought to everything, taking nothing for granted. "I would like to know more of that character, in whatever form that takes." The room was quiet. Outside, Seoul moved in its enormous way, lights beginning to come up against the early dark of the winter evening, the Han River catching the last of the sky. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the iron gate and the snow and the IV line and the documents and the coffee going cold and the 6 days of building something true from the rubble of something false. She thought about her mother's ring and what calm meant versus what hard meant. She thought about the choice, made in the first 5 minutes of consciousness in a strange, warm room, to be useful rather than afraid, and how that choice, repeated daily, had led her here to this room, to this man, to this conversation. She thought about what it meant that she was not, for the first time in a very long time, alone. "The Gangnam building," she said. "What are the terms?" The corner of his mouth did the thing it sometimes did. "That's what we'd be negotiating," he said. "Then we should probably start," she said. He reached for his phone. "I'll have Yoon arrange dinner," he said. "Somewhere with good lighting," she said. "I have notes." He looked at her. "Of course you do," he said. And this time, the thing at the corner of his mouth completed itself entirely, and it changed his face in a way that no camera and no security footage and no perimeter monitor would ever capture, because it belonged only to this room and this conversation and the particular quality of two people who had spent a long time being entirely alone and were, carefully, beginning to be less so. Outside, snow began again. Not the violent sideways blizzard of that first night. This was different. Soft and vertical and almost deliberate, the kind of snow that settles rather than assaults, that covers things gently, that makes the city quiet. Christabel stood at the glass for a moment before they left the office. She looked at it. The lights below, the river dark and silver, the white accumulation on the rooftops of the buildings that surrounded them. She pressed one hand to the cold glass and felt the temperature on her palm and did not pull back from it. She had stood in snow like this. She had been in it and on her knees, and with the cold inside her and her father's voice in the speaker, and the gate locked, and her name being removed from documents in rooms she would never enter again. She had been at the lowest point of the thing she had been given as a life, and she had gotten up. She had walked. She had been brought inside. And inside, she had not become grateful or compliant or small. She had become herself, more completely, more clearly, than she had been allowed to be in any room her family had ever welcomed her into. She took her hand from the glass. She turned. Kangmin was waiting by the door with his coat over his arm, and that precise, unhurried attention directed at her. And she walked to him, and they left the office together, and the door closed behind them. The question that stays, long after the footage ends and the snow settles and the credits, metaphorical or otherwise, roll. We spend our whole lives building walls to protect what we love. But what happens when the walls are built by the same people who were supposed to protect us? When the gate closes, and the snow comes, and you are alone on the outside of everything you were promised. Who do you become? And more urgently, more honestly, more uncomfortably. Would you have gotten up? If this story moved you, like, subscribe and drop a comment below telling us, was Christabel right to choose him? Or was she trading one powerful man's world for another? The next episode drops soon. Don't miss it.